Welcome to Enlightened Wealth Strategies, the podcast where insight and knowledge meet opportunity. Please join us as we navigate the world of finance, discovering actionable strategies to help you achieve your personal financial goals.
With decades of combined experience, we're here to shed light on the topics that matter most to your financial well-being. Whether you're accumulating, preserving, or distributing your wealth, this is the place for you.
Now let's dive in and start your journey to financial enlightenment.
Well, hello, James.
Good morning, Jim. How are you?
I'm good, and welcome to another episode of Enlightened Wealth Strategies.
Good. Glad to be here.
Today's topic is about tariffs.
Yeah, this is hitting big across the world, obviously. In recent months, you would think, though, based upon what's going on, it's cataclysmic and the economic civilization is going to collapse. But I think what we may want to do is talk a little bit, and then we're also going to have a guest.
Yes.
And we will then get into a little bit of what, maybe a little bit about the history of tariffs in itself. Mainly because I think people overlook the fact that tariffs have been around since the founding of our country.
That's funny that you say that. And I know you've done a lot of research in this, so I'm going to let you kind of lead the way about the history of this.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating in a way because I like history, firstly. And there's obviously, and this is economic history, but it's also a basis of how our country developed. And then I think if we walk through this a little bit and we go from the founding to where we are today and look at the different periods of time, why tariffs were instituted and where they actually worked and where they may not have worked, and how that may work, positively and negatively currently.
I agree.
So
there's a lot of, I guess, uncertainty from the public.
Yeah, and the other piece of it is mainstream economists have been trained to believe, rightly or wrongly, that tariffs are bad, and they look to two sources, I guess. And mainly it's going to have a negative impact on trade, but also our GDP. That's number one. And number two, they tend to look at what occurred during the Depression era, 1930s. They passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and that probably wasn't an ideal time in which to do that. And so, before we get into the history, perhaps I'll talk a little bit about this. At that time, we were predominantly a producer economy. We produced more than we consumed.
Correct.
So when you institute tariffs, it's actually counterproductive.
Yes.
Whereas today, we are the reverse type of economy. We are not producing as much as we consume.
Correct.
All right. So a lot of, and again, this goes, we look at the history and we see what occurred after World War II. There was the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the United States came out standing strong and everybody else was devastated around the world. So we were a production-oriented economy, so we helped prop up the rest of the world. And in the 50s and 60s, we experienced positive economy, strong economy, and then all of a sudden in the 70s, it's tended to change a bit. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, but of course we experienced high inflation. There was an oil crisis. We also were taken off the gold standard in 1971. But all that period of time, we experienced trade surpluses. Interestingly enough, since the gold standard was removed and the world went on no gold standard and fiat currency and exchanges and open accounts, it tended to change for the United States dramatically, particularly into the 80s and 90s and well into 2000. What occurred in 2000? You had the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which accepted China.
Right.
And then everything started to be outsourced.
Okay.
So that's probably the big issue, and perhaps some misunderstanding about where tariffs have coming from, and what they're trying to do, the Trump administration. I think that there's truth to what he says in the sense that it's not a level playing field.
I agree with that.
Our goods that are exported are tariffed, but things that come into our country are not. So we are taking the brunt of a lot. Now, there's you got to be really careful with some of this, because there could be not only unintended consequences, but there's a lot of other issues that you need to look at. I don't want to go into those specifics yet, but let's just look at the history for a little bit.
Sure.
I did go into more current history.
Yes, I saw that.
But that's okay. So 1789, Congress, after the founding of our country, actually instituted a 5% tariff on all imported goods that came into their ports.
And why did they do that?
Oh, they were in debt. So that was one way to do that. But they also needed to get their own industries and merchants, because it was predominantly a mercantile type of an economy at that time. So they needed to protect them.
So would you say that back then is similar to what it is today?
No.
Okay.
There's obvious some differences.
Right.
Because you're talking 250 years later. So the economies are different. But I do think what's happening too is that we are going to see, I think we're going to see the end of globalism as we have experienced over the last 30, 40 years.
Okay.
I think you're going to see more bilateral agreements as opposed to these multilateral agreements. And I think that's where they're going. Now, how they did things, we can question. We're not in the inner circle to know exactly what they did or didn't do, but they probably made some errors
along the way.
They may not have realized that perhaps the financial plumbing was going to come undone, because a lot of other countries, we rely on them to buy our government-issued securities, treasuries. And so who's the biggest buyers is actually Japan and China. And so if that were to dry up, that would have a big impact on us. So the argument can be stated, when you look at this history, they instituted tariffs and that policy not only in 1789, but in 1812 during the War of 1812,
right,
with Great Britain. And they raised them actually up to 25%. Then in the 1820s, it went up to 40%. So my point is, was not unheard of that tariffs were high.
Correct.
And then it continued well into the Civil War. They had to also finance the Union war effort.
Right.
And so they instituted tariffs there. They also had to protect, because the UK was interfering. They were supplying the Confederates. So because they didn't want to see a United States, so to speak. And then post-Civil War, they remained at 40%. But this is where Trump talks about, from the Industrial Revolution from 1871 to 1913. In this period of time, the U.S. GDP, right, gross domestic product, actually was growing on an average of 4.5% annually for that period of time.
That's a long...
That is a long stretch of time, and it was twice the pace of many other countries in the world, including the UK, United Kingdom. And they were a big force in the world at the time, right? Because their empire, as you well know, the sun never set. Right. On the UK. So tariffs basically protected steel industry, textiles, and many other areas of our manufacturing industries in the U.S. during that period of time. But what changed in 1913? You had the Woodrow Wilson, who was the president. A multitude of things occurred then. And it was also just before World War I in 1914. But 1913 was the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And we can dedicate a whole discussion on that, and we won't go there. But also that also was another was when the IRS was created,
Right.
And so it's also important to realize what their relationship is and what had happened to as with our country at that period of time. But now we move further and we go into the 20s. Tariffs were used, but if you recall, the 20s was a period of time where our economy boomed after World War I.
Right.
And then the Depression began to hit. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways in which Congress thought they were going to protect U.S. industry was to pass the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And it was counterproductive. And when you look at the history, it was part of it. There's never one reason that world events occur, but it was the precursor to World War II, because what it did was it forced a lot of other countries, mainly Germany and Japan, to take other parts of the world to get the raw material or oil or whatever they needed to build their economies.
Right.
And then the rest went from bad to worse thereafter. And then, as I mentioned before, at the end of World War II, the countries came together and realized, hey, we need to rebuild. We need to have trade agreements. And that's when Bretton Woods came out of it, and GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, occurred. And so we've been in that period of time until 2000, when the World Trade Organization occurred. And now what I think the Trump administration is really attempting to do is a multitude of things. And I say that because, they're directing a lot at China, but they're also directing a lot at our border neighbors, China, Mexico, and Canada, not only China.
Right.
And they want to, and it also ties in with what they're doing with, the border control, immigration policy, and the prevention of drugs coming across the border, particularly fentanyl. And I don't know what the statistics are, but they're probably astounding in the number of young people that are dying from it, intentionally or otherwise. So that has to stop. And so I think a lot of this is tied to that. And then the complications come in when they pushed out some of these tariffs. Tariffs can be instituted by presidential order, by legislative degree, and it's been predominantly, EOs that have been pushed out. But they pushed some of these out, and then they pulled them back because they realized what had happened. But they are trying to control what, I guess the complications come into China has a lot of factories in Mexico, both auto industry, parts, etc. And so how do you tariff Mexico or China and then Mexico as well? So, and not have an impact on our economy. So it becomes a little bit more complicated.
Very complicated.
Right. And so I think that is what occurred in recent months. Now, the markets, and we speak of markets as if they're in this inanimate object, but markets are composed of humans.
Right.
And they do not like, as you said earlier, we do not like uncertainty.
Right.
And I think the individual who's maybe bringing things back in center focus is the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent.
Okay.
I think the markets trust him. He's a calm voice, and I get the sense that he's becoming more and more of the face person who's out there trying to calm things, and he's helping to redirect things.
I know they put a stay on the tariffs for 90
days. Well, we're well into that, and we'll see what's going to happen over the next couple of months.
And there's no way of predicting as to what's going to be an end result here. But I do think that we need to address it. And one of the things that what we should do is introduce our guest.
I think so, yes.
And because he's done so much international investing that I think it will fit right in with all this communication about the tariffs.
Yeah, and we'd certainly be interested to hear what his opinion is and his thoughts.
I agree.
And perhaps he agrees with some of what I say, maybe not. And so we would like to know that. So we'd like to introduce Hervé. And we know what we're going to do. We're going to allow you to give us a little background about yourself and how you started in this industry and where you are currently.
Thank you, James. I started in this industry back in 1985 when I joined Scudder, Stevens & Clark, which was one of the white shoe companies on Wall Street. That was one of the pioneers in international investing. At the time, there were very few international mutual funds. I think there were only 3 at the time when I joined them. So I was an international analyst at first, became an international portfolio manager for Scudder. I was managing the Scudder Variable Life International Fund. Then I launched for another company, PaineWebber, another company that doesn't exist anymore, but that some of you are familiar with. I launched the European Growth Fund for PaineWebber and managed that for a few years, became then the head of international investment at Provident Capital Management and managed international fund for them and launched an emerging market fund. I had a few more jobs after that, working for Schroders, which is a very prominent company in London. And then 15 years ago, started my own company called Mercator, and I was a independent advisor to the Oppenheimer Global Fund and traveled with the portfolio manager around the world. And over all these years, managed to meet with a lot of CEOs and CFOs in Japan, in Europe, in Latin America. And so I spent a lot of time with on the ground, kicking tires and with CFOs and CEOs abroad. And now I'm managing some separate international accounts and working on creating an international ETF for Mercator.
Okay, that's great.
So that's my background.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Look forward to it.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Hervé, why don't you give us a little bit of background? When you say you've been all over, I mean, literally all over, or just in the European countries, or have you been?
No, I've traveled even to places like Ukraine or Iraq or places like that, not always to invest, but to get a sense of what's going on. Last year I was, in China, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, just to kind of understand the whole, all the issues related to chip manufacturing. And so, no, I'm really talking about a lot of different countries, not just Europe.
What do you see happening out there, and with regards to the tariffs?
Well, I think, James, you mentioned that, in the 30s, we used tariffs to protect an economy when we were no longer the producers of the world. So if you start protecting your economy, but you are more you're exporting or importing, makes a big difference. If you look at China right now, China is exporting, and its whole economy is based on exports, and that's how they've built their economy. Their internal consumption, the private consumption, is like less than 40%.
Very low.
It's very low. It's less than 40%, which compares to more than 2/3 in the United States. So for them, tariffs is going to hurt dramatically because they don't have the internal demand to absorb all the extra production. Now, for us, it's the opposite. Now, so I think it's a big issue for a country like China, and I think China is probably the main target of what's going on, even though we have to, level to bring the level playing field all over the world. That Japan has abused the system, and Europe has abused the system, but never to the extent that the Chinese are taking advantage of the system.
Do you see the tariffs working at leveling the playing field?
Well, I think it's not just tariffs first. It's
okay.
The non-tariffs are more important actually than the tariffs themselves.
It's the trade agreements.
It's the
right?
trade agreement that really matters.
Right.
Japan is the champion of non-tariff barriers. I mean, back in the 80s, we were joking about Japan would not let the French export their skis to Japan because the snow in Japan was different. They would come up with stories like that to protect their markets. And even today, they have a lot of non-tariff barriers. So even if the tariffs are not as high as you think, not as high to protect their market, they have other ways to protect their market. So it's a combination of both.
How skewed are the agreements?
Well, I don't know where that's going. I mean, we're in the midst of major negotiations, and it's going to be interesting to see how it's going to go. China has chosen to be confrontational about it. They want to continue to take advantage of the system and don't want anything to change. Japan, I think, is much more realistic, and it's a society that is more ready to compromise. And so I think the Japanese will try to compromise and then may or may not stick to the agreement. That's a different issue. And the Europeans are somewhere in between. The Europeans, I think, are hurt with what's going on. They didn't expect this to come, and they already had to face the whole NATO issue with Trump, that Trump was forcing them to take their responsibility from a defense point of view. So right now, they're still a little bit in shock. But I think they will come to the table. And I think if Europe and if Japan, come to the negotiating table, talk to us, and I think Trump is reasonable enough to find a compromise somewhere. And China, I think, will not have any choice and will have to dramatically change its economy.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about China is that they're stubborn right now with their view, but eventually they're going to have to come around and make an agreement and negotiate, mainly because, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is they have a debt crisis, they have a real estate crisis, they have a number of other issues. I've actually heard rumors that some people some workers have not been paid for months.
Correct.
And there are some levels. Look, it's not an open society. It's still a communist party that dictates, and they're taking on elements of capitalism. But from my understanding, that there are, in fact, some revolts that are going on, mini revolts, where
it's very difficult.
Businesses, but it's difficult to get that information out.
Yeah, but we know, for example, that even before this issue of tariffs, the youth unemployment was already above 20%. So they already have an unemployment problem and a lack of growth of their economy to absorb all the young people joining the workforce. So I think you're right. I think China is getting hurt much more than they will let us know. I mean, I think yesterday they said, all at once we found out that the Chinese will no longer publish a number of economic indicators. Now, if you don't,
so?
They've stopped publishing those numbers. Now, why would they do that? Why would you hide the economic indicators if the numbers are good? So the numbers are not good at all.
Exactly.
I think China is getting hurt, and but because of the Chinese mentality of saving face, they cannot show weakness. And that's what's going on right now. So I think the Trump administration is trying to give them a way to save face and come to the negotiating table. And we've seen some movement in that direction. But the Chinese would rather go down with the ship than to lose face.
And they'll take everybody else with them if they have to.
Exactly, unfortunately.
If they could. But look, I think the other reason why the Trump administration is doing this too is they're trying to bring back a lot of manufacturing companies to the United States to have growth here, have higher paying jobs, and it really ties in. But they're also doing it, as you pointed out before, too, from we've been protecting and paying for. We've been carrying everybody's load when it comes to the defense systems, NATO in particular.
That's correct.
But because we outsourced our manufacturing since the early 90s, when during the Clinton administration, over 90,000 manufacturing plants have left the United States. That's astounding, those numbers. So even if and look, I think he said a couple of different things. What did he say? Like billions of dollars on all these new companies have made commitments.
I think he's talking about trillions of dollars.
It's up to trillions. And the tariffs, my understanding that he announced that they've collected $15 billion in tariffs. So one question I have for you with regard to that, because most people think that tariffs are collected by the government. And other people are out there saying, no, when I'm an exporter and I'm an importer, so when I get this, I have to fill out a sheet and I have to pay it. Well, yeah, you do pay it, but it's like sales. It's like a sales tax.
Yeah.
And so you still have to submit it to the government. Correct?
I think that's correct. That's my understanding. Yeah. But this whole repatriation of production is not an easy thing, because I was talking to the CFO of a Belgian company last week, and they have their production both in Belgium and in China. And their main market is the United States. 40% of their sales are in the United States. And I said, well, are you going to bring the production in the United States? Well, they said no, because our production in China uses a lot of subcontractors locally. So even if you move the production in the United States, you still have to buy all these components from China, and those will be tariffed. So it doesn't help. So this company says, well, we're probably going to shift the production out of China but into Europe, because then we can, import the components in Europe and pay lower tariffs, and then export to the United States and pay 10% tariffs, because that's probably where it's going to end up.
And it'll wind up being cheaper.
And yes,
than the tariffs they would have paid if they left it in China.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, that's the other piece of that too. Is you said earlier you've traveled throughout Southeast Asia, which we tend to look at a map. And when you look at it in that perspective, you see China here, right? You see all these countries around them. But if you looked at it downward from their perspective, they're actually surrounded by Vietnam and Malaysia and Singapore and India, which they share a border with, and they tend to have some, issues. Currently, India's having some issues with Pakistan, which are not always very pleasant, because they're both nuclear powers, as we know. But when you look at that, are there not a lot of companies that are already in those countries that I cited, but are beginning to move some of their manufacturing plants to those countries because it is cheaper and they might be able to get better agreements?
Definitely. And not only foreign companies that have decided to move their production out of China into Vietnam, for example, but a lot of Chinese companies are doing that. And they're producing, that's why we have these high tariffs at this moment before the negotiating, or at the beginning of the negotiations with Vietnam, for example, because the Trump administration does know very well that a lot of Chinese companies now produce or transit through Vietnam and then say made in Vietnam. And so they can export it not as a Chinese export, but as a Vietnamese export. So there's a lot of that going on, not just in Mexico, where the Chinese are producing a lot of Mexico to import or to export.
They circumvent the tariff. Exactly. Is really what they're trying to do.
And they are really doing it. Yeah. And they are doing it.
And they did it in his first administration. And so he's had 4 extra years to really understand what happened and how to correct it.
Exactly. And so that's, I think, part of the negotiation right now. It's not just about, let's bring the tariffs at the same level, because I think the Vietnamese are already offering to bring tariffs down to 0. But, they have to understand, yes, but if, what are the implications? And then what I mentioned earlier on, the non-tariff barriers, which is another way to protect. And then there's a third way, of course, is to manipulate the currency.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you another question, too, with regard to this. And then we want to touch on how this affects people's ability to invest, because uncertainty, we tend to, what do we do?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just watched a segment, I guess one of the executive directors of the Los Angeles port, basically saying within 5 to 7 weeks, U.S. store shelves will be empty. I think it's a stretch. But is there certain items, perhaps, that will disappear for a period of time? And then now we're in, as Jim mentioned before, we're in this 90-day phase where they're going to negotiate. But you and I both know sometimes it takes a heck of a lot longer to do negotiations. So what happens if that happens, where consumers need to go out and they can't find the product or good that they want? And then if they do, is it going to be more expensive? And then if they don't, how long is it going to take to restart the supply chain?
Well, I have great confidence in the free market. I think, especially in America, we're really good at adjusting very quickly. Now, this is very disruptive. There's no doubt about it. And there will be, periods where people say, oh, there's, shortage of this or that product. I don't know. Nobody knows, I think, at this point. But the free market has a ways of finding solutions for problems like that. So, but disruption is what Trump is all about. And,
I call him the great disruptor.
I mean, that's what he does. But he is not doing just for the sake of it. He's doing it because the system has been stretched too much, and too many countries have taken advantage
of the United States. Yeah,
and so there will be other disruptions in prices as well. And I think we will see some prices go up because you can't find the item when you have to produce it locally, or you have to pay high tariffs. And so you will have a one-off adjustment. I don't think that's the beginning of inflation, especially since a lot of other prices are coming down, with energy prices coming down, which is really the key that, they're counting on.
I think you're right. And I think what they have done is they really are incentivizing the energy industry to counteract the inflation and the change in these tariffs.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Yeah.
And that's a great news for economies like Japan or Europe. They are major importers of energy, of oil and gas, because they import in Germany. They import their energy mostly from Russia, but Japan imports all its gas and all its oil. They don't produce any of it locally, so they are really benefiting from that. So when you look around the world and opportunities that may arise, well, the energy policy of the Trump administration is greatly benefiting countries in Europe and in Japan.
Yeah, because we send, 80% of Europe's LNG to them? Is that correct?
Germany. LNG. But
yes.
LNG, that's liquid natural gas,
right,
is only a small portion of the natural gas that Germany imports. So Germany used to import most of its gas, like over 55% of their imports of gas came from Russia through pipelines mostly. And then it comes from Norway, it comes from Amsterdam. But so now they have to replace that. But they're still importing a lot of gas from Russia, by the way, even though...
it's going through other countries.
It's going to France, it's going through Netherlands, and so on.
It's not going directly.
It's not going directly, but still, it's going through other European countries who have, they have policies that want to restrict Russian exports, but they cannot help themselves. They have to import natural gas from Russia, and so it's kind of interesting to see. Even though we are in a Cold War with Russia again, we're still importing a lot. We Europeans are still importing a lot of natural gas from Russia.
Yeah, there's to that point. How does Europe recover or adjust, perhaps might be the right word, from their deindustrialization policies? Because they've destroyed all their coal-based plants. Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, as you mentioned, so now they have to find all these other ways. And the Green Party there kind of instituted a lot of these policies. And Germany was the strongest EU member.
Correct. Yeah.
So what happens to...
It's a good question. I don't think the Europeans haven't figured it out yet. They're still doubling down on alternative energy, solar energy, wind energy, and investing dramatically in so-called green energy. But they have a real issue. So they can no longer rely on the supply of oil and gas from Russia. They're trying to import more LNG from the United States, but that doesn't happen overnight. You don't have the infrastructure for the moment. So I think Europe is still doubling down on solar and wind energy and maybe some other alternative. But I think what they're starting to realize, even in Germany that has banned nuclear energy, I think the Europeans are realizing they're going to have to invest more in nuclear energy. And I think that will be, but they're not there yet. It's part of the conversation in France, which has a lot of nuclear energy already.
Yes.
I think they're more prone to adopt more nuclear energy, but I don't think the Europeans have figured it out. And then the industrialization of Europe is going to be an interesting one as well, because again, Germany has invested so heavily in China. They have a lot of production in China, and they realize that is an issue at this point. And so they're trying to bring back production in Germany, but it's very difficult to produce Volkswagens or BMWs or Mercedes in Germany when labor is so expensive and the energy is so expensive. I mean, because of the reliance on alternative energy, electricity in Germany is between 2 and 3 times what we pay here. How do you compete with other companies and then 4 times the price that the Chinese would pay for energy? So they have a really disadvantage, a cost disadvantage. That's why Germany and Europe, those economies are stagnating at this point. And so I think there's a big debate going on. I mean, Trump has, shaken the world and definitely shaking the political debate in Europe. And you see a lot of moving parts in Europe. And we don't know where this is going, but they will have to find a solution.
Yeah, as Victor, you're familiar with Victor Davis Hansen?
Yes, I am.
Okay. He as he stated, this is a counter-revolution.
Correct.
That's being conducted.
Yes.
In so many facets, not just, foreign trade and tariffs and, trade policies, et cetera. But he's doing it both domestically and on a foreign basis, for good or for bad, but he's disrupting the status quo.
And if you look at what happened with the Reagan Revolution back in the 90s, the 80s, and then, it had a ripple effect in Europe. In the 90s, you had all these free market reforms in Europe. That was kind of the ripple effects of the Reagan Revolution here in the United States. Now, I think something similar is happening in Europe, whereas Europe is always looking at what's going on in America, and you already see the so-called populist party, gaining momentum in every European country. In every country, and it's getting stronger and stronger because I think Europeans are fed up with the status quo because it's not working. Mm-hmm. So they want to change. Now, you may or may not like the change that's coming, but they need a change. And
with change, I always felt that there's opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah.
And even though we don't necessarily like change, the opportunities that come from it is extensive.
And I totally agree with you. And I think I see it here in the United States because it's bringing trillions of dollars of investments in our reindustrialization. Something similar will happen. I was talking about this example of this Belgian company, shifting its production out of China back into Europe. I think more and more of that is going to happen. The German manufacturers have really invested so heavily in China, they have to take it back home or at least find another place to produce because you cannot rely on China, which is a country that doesn't believe in the rule of law. So you cannot, your assets are at risk if you are in China. So I think people are realizing that you cannot put all your eggs in the Chinese basket. It's a very dangerous.
When you say they're at risk, you mean that they can confiscate your plant and equipment.
Yes. Or even put you to jail. I mean, we've seen it. Right. We've seen it where CEOs won't travel to China because they're afraid. I think we're finally realizing this is still a communist country, and Xi Jinping is taking the country back to a Maoist country. And that
do you think that? Yes,
he's a great admirer of Mao, and he definitely doesn't like Deng Xiaoping, who was the great reformer of China. I mean, the whole world started with Deng Xiaoping's reform, and he's taking it back to pre-Deng Xiaoping policies. Definitely,
that's a scary thought.
I'm afraid I don't want to scare people, but I've been very negative ever since he became the great chairman again.
Yeah, for life.
For life, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Which, and going back to what you mentioned earlier about their high youth unemployment, I think perhaps maybe one of the reasons for them behaving the way they do is when you're in power, you want to remain in power. So you need to put a lid on it and prevent revolution, which historically China has had a lot of rebellion and revolution through its history.
Yes, exactly.
And so would it be any different today?
Well, he has a difficult task, because if he loses face and he is perceived to be weak relative to the Tariffs and the Trump administration, I think the party itself will get rid of him. He has to be seen as a strong leader. But if the economy collapses, you may have so much social unrest that the change may come from social unrest. So he has to navigate between those two issues. One, you don't want to be seen as weak, but on the other hand, you don't want the economy to collapse, and the economy is collapsing. It was already doing very poorly.
Really, that's correct.
And so now this, considering that the whole economy is based on exports, that's a big issue.
I have a question for you with regard to their population, and then I want to shift to other countries, in particular India, and then maybe we could talk a little bit about where we can do some investing. But I heard and read that the population in India is 1.4 billion?
Again, I don't think we have exact numbers, but it's a larger population than in China.
Correct. And China is 1.2 billion, so we've been told.
Yeah.
I actually heard that it's less, it's like 40% less than that.
Interesting. I don't know.
Now, again, we don't know because they don't give figures that are accurate. They inflate things across the board because it's controlled by the Communist Party. So you never really know what information. You can't rely on the information that you're getting.
Never could. I mean, that was always an issue when people say China is growing at 8%, and you never knew it was true.
Right.
The target was 8%, and they always reached their target, which was kind of interesting. We're not as good as they are. So that's the problem with China. But one thing is for sure is that China is getting old before it is getting rich. Japan is getting old, and everybody talk about aging of the population, but Japan is a rich country and can take care of their old people, and they have the money to build an economy around that. For China, it's coming too early. They're not rich enough to take care of an old population. And now that they don't have the young people replacing, they don't have the population to pay for the old Chinese people. And it's a real issue.
So they have an aging population issue.
Definitely.
To add to their youth unemployment, to add to the fact that another thing that we haven't even discussed is China is a massive country.
Yes.
But not very much of it is farmland, where they have to import a lot of food to feed their population.
Correct.
So that could also be a big problem for them if they don't come to the table sooner than later.
And I think they have another problem is the free market would take care of these problems. But they don't believe in free market anymore. It's an economy that's controlled by the top, and the top decides, we're going to invest everything in electric vehicles, or we're going to invest everything in that. And so they don't let the free market take care of the imbalances. And I think that's where we're going to see once again that free markets are the solution, because the free market will take care of these imbalances. But the guy in Beijing cannot decide, there's a problem there, try to solve the problem because he doesn't know that there are bigger problems on the other side that he hasn't seen. So you cannot control an economy from the top down. And I think the Soviet Union has proven that, and the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany have proven that. I mean, they can be very successful. Well, and I remember people saying that China has an advantage because they can all move in the same direction because they will follow the leader. Well, that's their problem in the long run. In the short run, it looks like very efficient because they say, okay, we're going to invest everything in solar energy. They took over the solar energy globally. But then they create these imbalances. Same thing with electric vehicles. And then at a certain point, the whole thing blows up. And
it's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable.
Okay. Yeah. Now, going back to what I mentioned before with regard to India, I don't know if that's a country that you have visited or not.
That's unfortunately a country that I don't know much about. I cannot give you.
Okay, so the reason why I bring it up is I read an article recently. So let's say that their population is 1.4 billion people. That's a massive population, and they say that 300 million are their middle class. That almost equates to the size of our population.
Correct. Yes.
Right? I mean, that's when you put it in perspective.
Yes.
The article really was basically saying that they have there's a well-educated portion of their population, and they have a lot of industry and high tech as well. And so, is that a place that should be considered as far as future investing?
Well, I think we see that happening. Apple is moving into India and moving a lot of its production out of China into India. But it's not as simple as that. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on India or China for that matter. I know a little bit more about China. But India has a problem with infrastructure and corruption that is really holding them back. They don't have the infrastructure, and they're a little bit, there's a lot of corruption that makes it very difficult to operate in a country like that. But it's moving in the right direction, and I think over time you're going to see not just Apple, but a lot more companies moving into India as an alternative of cheap labor and cheaper production base.
Yeah, they are in the early stages. It's
Yes.
almost a little bit like the Wild West was.
A little bit, you're right. It's a good,
But they are moving, as you said, in the right direction. That's the sense I got from the article that I had read. I don't, I bring this to our attention because I don't know that enough attention is brought to these certain areas of the world. Mm-hmm. So having said that, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, basically said, I guess in one of these interviews, that our economy, the U.S. economy, is like a barbell economy. The energy sector on one side, finance and tech on the other side, and everything in between, it needs to grow again. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I think, and he puts it like, we are going to promote Main Street over Wall Street. And I think I spent my whole career on Wall Street, so I kind of bought into this whole globalization and free trade, and that everybody believed in it, and we thought that free trade and globalization would bring China on board, and China would become a democracy just because they will see the interest in free market and the voting rights, and so there was this belief in this whole global system, and I think we didn't realize that it was at the expense of Main Street. I mean, so many jobs and so many companies have moved out of this country. And there's a whole, section of our workforce that was just completely neglected and just lost their job.
They're been hollowed out.
It hollowed out, yeah. Right? And I think, at this point, many people realize that, that logic went too far. It's okay to, have free markets, but to export all your production to China, well, first of all, it hollows out, the center of the country. But
haven't we adapted, though, over the years? Because they started exporting a lot of this stuff, back in the 80s? 90s?
Yeah, but the more we did, the more we exported, because everybody started, emulating the whole idea of, I can produce out of China, it's cheaper, and so, I don't think we've had that. I mean, we've taken advantage of the whole system that worked for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we went where there was cheap labor, cheap capital, and cheap currency.
Yeah. And very efficient. I mean, they were very efficient at doing it.
Well, they're great copycatters.
Yeah, but, they were able to do it.
Well, I guess what I was getting at, though, is the population that ended up not having a job to go to. Mm-hmm. I feel that they've adapted and changed what their motivation for work would be. at this point. And won't we adapt again?
Well, if you mean we will adapt if we bring back manufacturing and higher paying jobs, but I think it's not going to be to the level or the similarities to what it was in the 60s and 70s before everything was offshored. We're going to morph into doing different things. I think a lot of these jobs are going to be in high-tech industry. Maybe it's going to be into, robotics and nanotechnology and quantum computing and whatnot. Am I incorrect in that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. But there's also a risk involved, because now we no longer have the production of medicine in this country that we may need at a certain point. So it's one thing to export all this production to a friendly country, but China is not exactly a friendly country. No. So there is a major risk involved in doing that. So if you're going to export all the production to a country, you want to do it to a friendly country that you can rely on in the long run, or at a moment of crisis, you want to be able to rely on that country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry, our defense industry, it's amazing. We have sent so much to Ukraine and Israel that our armed forces are depleted.
That's what I hear.
Yeah, if we were to go into a war, according to Colonel Douglas McGregor, I don't know if you've ever listened to him, but he basically said we wouldn't last a week. Now, I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but let's even say if it's a month, that's not a very good thought.
No. So, I don't know about that, but one thing is for sure is that the Europeans are not ready, and we've seen that now with the crisis in Ukraine, that the Germans finally woke up to this, and that's why this new government that may or may not be installed today, I think he was finally elected as chancellor. Friedrich Merz lost the elections this morning, and then I don't know, they were going to vote a second time.
I didn't hear that.
Anyway, the plan is to spend a lot of money to rebuild their military in Germany and all over Europe. Now, they finally got the message that NATO has, every member of NATO has to participate and spend the money, because they realize that maybe America will not come to their defense. So there's a big awakening happening in countries like Germany. France was always, more independent militarily than
the US and Great Britain, the same thing. Yeah. I mean, they have the troops that they have available, or the numbers would astound you. They're less than 100,000 available troops.
Yeah. But it's also the the armament. I mean, they don't have the whatever you need today. I mean, is it drones, or is it the planes,
ammunition, or tanks?
Well, they definitely don't have the ammunition, right?
They don't have it. No.
So now there's going to be a huge investment being made in the defense industry in Europe, especially in Germany, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and that may have ripple effects on technology, I think, as well, because right now it's all about technology. That's how you win a war. And so now the Germans and the French always did, but will spend even more. And all the Europeans are going to spend more on their defense industry, which has implications for technology that may kind of revive, give a boost to European technology as well.
Okay, so to that point, in your ETF, will you be investing predominantly, as you had in the past, in Europe? And are there European defense companies that you would consider, or are you going to only consider or also add the large U.S. defense companies?
No, it would be purely international. So that would be a diversification, because my expertise is international, and I think it should come as an addition, because most Americans already have U.S. equities through their U.S. ETFs or whatever. So if I would add a global fund, we call it a global fund, that invests both in the United States and internationally, that would have like a duplicating function, because you already have so much exposure to the United States. So my focus is only on the United States, outside of the United States, and that is mainly Europe and Japan, the more developed economies, because that's where you find really companies with high value added element to their business, with companies that add technology or services and so on. If you go outside of Europe or Japan, you're dealing with countries like Latin America or some other Asian countries where you mostly invest in commodities. There's no real value added to their economy. So I want to have companies that have secular growth because I invest for like 5 to 10 years minimum. And so if I can find companies that have secular growth because of their what we sometimes call a moat, or because what they have the value added part of their business gives them 10 years of growth. Whereas if you buy commodities, you're going to be up 1 year, you're going to be down 1 year, and you have very little control over the profit margins.
So you're looking predominantly in, correct me if I'm wrong, more mature industries within the developed countries.
But I'm not sure it's mature industries. There can be new industries in the software industry or something like that. But where you cannot just compete by digging in a hole or having a real special advantage that gives you that long-term perspective and the long-term growth potential, which I would call secular growth, not just be dependent on the GDP growth or dependent on demand for a certain product, but something that, you can plan for the next 5 years and you can actually charge a good profit margin because it's quite unique, because you're adding so much value.
And you're also beginning to limit your risks as opposed to investing in these other countries.
Yes, that too.
Where
the political risk is also one.
Yeah, the geopolitical risks and a whole host of other risks as well.
Yeah.
Give us a few more minutes, though, just about how you do determine what companies you do invest in, because I know that you go through a pretty detailed process. In addition to traveling there and actually meeting, which is not as common. And that's how you started. Mm-hmm. And I don't think as many fund managers really do that as often.
Well, I think, I'm doing the old-fashioned way, stock picking, and just kick tires and meet with the CEOs. I like to focus on smaller, medium-sized companies where the CEO is still usually the founder himself, who had a vision, who knows where he's going, and he has something strong to sell in the future, and he has skin in the game as well. So that's really what I'm looking for. And again, I'm looking at a 5 to 10 year perspective. What is this company bringing? We talk about technology, for example. There's this Canadian company that's bought a German company that makes the batteries for underwater drones. Now, that is going to be a big thing. When you rebuild your military, the underwater drones will be something that most countries are investing very heavily in. Now, they have this very unique battery that can go as deep as 6,000 meters underwater and survive the pressure that deep in the water. And it can last for a very long period of time. And apparently there's no other battery that has that kind of capacity. So those are the kind of value added that I'm talking about, that you have such a technology advantage, and there's a lot of demand coming down the road, because we know that Germany is rebuilding its military, Japan is rebuilding its military. So the demand is there, and the technology is the technology of the future. That's how you're going to fight the war underwater. Submarines.
Interesting. Yeah, it is.
So there, you can find those kind of unique technologies or unique companies that have a unique service that they're good at, or something like that. Or a fashion. You go to Italy or you go to France, they really understand fashion. They've built a brand name like Ferrari. Now, the brand name of Ferrari is worth a lot of money. So you know the demand for Ferrari will always be higher than the supply, because that's how they've built their brand name. They always make sure there's more demand than supply. So they will never produce 20,000 Ferraris. They will always keep it, around 10,000, so that the demand will always be strong. So they've built this image and this demand imbalance, the demand offer imbalance. So these are the kind of unique companies that have long-term potential and have very high margins, because if you sell a Ferrari, you can charge whatever price you want. People will pay whatever price. So these are the kind of unique businesses I'm looking for around the world. in the technology, in the fashion, or the service software, special software
And so
companies.
it's okay whether they're small cap, large cap, or anything in between.
Well, you tend to find them more in the small to medium cap companies because that's where the growth is. Once you get to the big companies, the large companies in Europe, they tend to be, they've already matured. The market is complete. There's not much more growth. I mean, growth is limited when you're really big. I mean, look at Apple. How much more can Apple grow at this point unless they come up with a new product?
So in wrapping up, because we're up against the clock, in a minute or less, just maybe summarize for us, what your thoughts are moving forward and where people could look for opportunities to invest, not just, and of course, mainly with your particular new fund.
Well, I'm focusing on international markets. So I think the United States is definitely always a good place to invest, but you want to diversify a little bit. And international markets have underperformed so much for so long that you kind of wonder, so many companies are undervalued just because they've been neglected. Because the U.S. market, especially U.S. technology companies, the Magnificent Seven, have attracted so much capital that people have neglected other opportunities like the ones I just mentioned. And so they look to me, a number of these companies look very undervalued at this point. With the potential of major changes coming. And that, it's not clear yet. Europe is going through, a lot of soul searching, I would say, at this point. And they have to react to what's going on here in the United States and what's going on in China. And Japan has already moved towards more of a market-friendly market, whereas in the past, the Japanese companies, the quoted companies, the public companies, really neglected their shareholders dramatically. They didn't care about the shareholders. There was no dividend, there were no buybacks. They didn't care. There was no visibility. Now, all that is changing. And Japan is kind of embracing stock markets, economy much more. So both Japan and Europe, having underperformed so long, are now so undervalued compared to the U.S. market that it makes sense to go. I think they find a lot of opportunities, but they don't. These opportunities will not happen. Will not make you rich overnight because people have to rediscover it. But I've noticed in the last few years that I see great companies with great results publishing, great quarterly performance numbers, and the stock doesn't go anywhere because the money is not interested in buying those companies. But that will change. The cheaper it gets and the more successful they are, eventually the money will flow back towards the international market. It's been all in one direction over the last 10 years, really. Yeah. And we're going to see a change. And that could happen very fast. And I think it's a good diversification.
It's a good opportunity for us to have our clients look at your new fund, for sure.
I appreciate that.
Anyway, well, we want to thank you for being here as our guest, and perhaps in the near future, we will have you back again, Hervé.
Thank you very much, James and Jim. Thank you.
It's much appreciated.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Enlightened Wealth Strategies. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and inspiring.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow and subscribe to our podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform to stay updated on new episodes.
Your financial journey doesn't end here. Connect with us online for even more resources and exclusive content.
Until next time, remember, financial enlightenment is just an enlightened wealth strategy away. Investment advice is offered through Bell Point Asset Management, LLC, 500 Demont Ranch, Parkway Building 700, Unit 700, Reno, Nevada, 89521. Additional information about Bell Point Asset Management is available on the SEC's website at www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. It is important to read our disclosures available at this link, www.bellpointasset.com/disclosures. The information provided in this presentation is educational and limited to the dissemination of general information. This material is not intended to be a recommendation of any kind, investment, tax, or accounting advice. Does not constitute a solicitation to buy, sell, or hold a security or an investment strategy. Engage in any financial transaction and is not provided in a fiduciary capacity. The information provided does not take into account the specific objectives or circumstances of any particular investor or suggest any specific course of action.
Investment decisions should be made based on an investor's objectives and circumstances and in consultation with his or her financial professionals. While the advisor uses reasonable efforts to obtain information from sources believed to be reliable, the advisor makes no representation that the information or opinions contained in this material are accurate, reliable, or complete. All information and opinions contained in this material are subject to change without notice. The views and opinions expressed are for informational and educational purposes only as of the date of the production or writing and may change without notice at any time based on numerous factors such as market or other conditions, legal and regulatory developments, additional risks and uncertainties, and may not come to pass. This material may contain forward-looking information that is not purely historical in nature. Securities offered through Fortune Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA and SIPC, Bellpoint Asset Management, LLC, and Fortune Financial Services, Inc. are not affiliated. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investing involves risks. Principal losses possible.